Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Resilient Leadership Podcast, where everything we talk about is aimed at helping you to lead with a greater sense of calm, clarity, and conviction, even in uncertain times. My name is Bridget Tyre, and as always, I'm joined today by my co-host, my collaborator, my colleague, and good friend, Irvine Nugent. Irvine, you're looking snappy there in your beautiful blue shirt. Tell us how you're doing.
I'm doing fabulous, the best of kind of we're eking out of summer and the weather is glorious. So I'm enjoying this beautiful weather and feeling grateful that, in this DC area, you just think you're there and all of a sudden the weather comes around and slaps you on the cheek and says, yeah, I've still got a few 100-degree days left. So fingers crossed, we're kind of easing into my favorite season, which is fall. So I'm having it. It was a great summer. I did a little bit of travel. I was telling you before we recorded, got back from Norway, which is bucket list. And when you are immersed in beauty, especially the beauty of nature, it's so wondrous. You enter into mystery and awe. And I felt I had a little adventure in mystery and awe.
Ooh.
How about yourself, Bridget? How are you?
Well, first of all, I love that. An adventure in mystery and awe. I had a little touch of that. I didn't go as far as you, but I was over the weekend in a cabin in the woods on a beautiful lake. And there were a few of those moments that you spoke of where I just was looking up at the sky and the trees and the birds and just feeling that sense of awe and wonder, as you said.
Love it. Love it. We need it. We need moments. I think it's a reminder that we do in the midst of the craziness of life, that wherever that place is for us, that we get to go there and recharge. I love it.
Yes, so important, because without that, the challenges of life could wear us down, right? But both of us sound like we got re-inspired and reinvigorated.
Yeah, I feel more energized. So I'm excited. What's our topic? Let us know. What are we going to dive into and digest today?
Well, so today we are going to build on some of our previous podcast episodes on the topic of curiosity, which we covered, broadly speaking, in 2 previous episodes. But today we're going to talk about specifically the power of asking curious questions, and specifically the power that they have to unlock more of the potential in the people around us, whether that's our colleagues, our employees, our loved ones, whomever. The thing about questions is that as coaches, you and I ask questions for a living, essentially. I think of it sometimes like that, right?
Yep.
And we're trained in it. We don't always get the opportunity to be asked curious questions that, maybe unlock an insight for us or provoke some thoughts or new action. But I'm going to guess that at some time in your life, Irvine, somebody asked you a really great, curious question that did that for you. Can you recall one?
I'm going to recall one quite recently, actually. I was at dinner and, you have your perfunctory questions, which are, like, where did you grow up? I mean, that's one. It's like, well, there's an invitation there, kind of an indication, but more often the default answer to that is, well, I grew up in the north of Ireland. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But this person said to me, tell me a little bit more about the neighborhood you grew up in. And it was like, whoa, what a beautiful, curious question, which actually invited some exploration and flavor and talking about the neighborhood. And it just initiated this really lovely conversation, because then, of course, well, what about your neighborhood? And it was so rich. And I thought it really began with a beautiful, curious question, which was just a little nuance on a question that we so often ask.
I love that. And you're right. It's a little tweak, but it sounds like it took the conversation in a richer direction.
Yeah, very, very much so. Yeah. How about you, Bridget? Can you remember a time when you were asked like a really curious question that got you,
Yeah, now this one, unlike you, wasn't recent. It was years ago, but it has stayed with me. And I think when people ask you questions from a deep place of curiosity, sometimes that's what happens. Like, you always remember kind of that question. So I remember I was talking to a friend who happens to also be a coach, and we were chatting about some things. And I guess I was sharing with her some challenges and some stuff going on in my life. And she got kind of quiet. And she said, Bridget, when I listen to you, it's so clear to me that you spend a lot of time and energy sitting with and listening to people in your life and at work, and that you take such good care of them. And then she paused again and she said, and I'm just really curious, who does that for you?
Mm. Great question.
It kind of caused me to really take a step back. And as I reflected on that, what occurred to me was, that's a great question. Never really thought about that. And I began to, I guess, take a little bit of a inventory of that. And I realized I had two insights. There were a couple of people that showed up that way for me. And the action I eventually took was to write them a note and thank them for that.
Mm.
But the other thing that occurred to me was that I probably wasn't allowing people to show up that way for me as much as I could and wanted to or needed to. And that ended up kind of getting me to think differently about, what was my role in that? So it's always stayed with me. Isn't it interesting how questions can do that for us?
Yeah, totally.
So, when we think about asking questions from a place of curiosity, and we're talking about this, we're talking to our listeners who are busy managers, busy leaders, right? They got a lot to do and a lot to get done. And my observation, and I'm curious if this is true for you, is that most busy managers and leaders talk more, tell more, share more than they ask or listen. And, I'm curious if that's been your observation as well. And if it is, why do you think that is so?
It's a great question. I agree. I think that is the case. I think it's the default, put it like that. I think it's our default. Why does that happen? There's a few things that come to mind. One is, I think, as we rise through the ranks, certainly what we initially develop is our expertise and our knowledge base. When we start a job, we want to know more about the job. And I think part of what comes to the fore is kind of to be the SME, to be the person that knows everything about this. And so therefore, it's only natural that if we are the subject matter expert, that we have expertise to share. And so therefore, if someone needs to know someone, they ask us, and that becomes a muscle for us. We have knowledge to impart. And so the telling becomes important. So I think part of that, and in fact, actually, just as an aside, that becomes the most painful transition then to go from SME to leader or to manager of people, because managing people is different from having a body of knowledge to share.
Yes.
And so therefore, we really, we aren't trained to ask curious questions. We've gone through a coaching school, and that was part of the training, but no other professions do that. It would be wonderful if people had courses on asking curious questions. So I think we're not trained to do that. And there's a skill to that, a noticing. And then I think the last thing that mitigates against it, even people who have the capacity to answer curious questions, and that is just the crunch for time. It's this craziness that we feel that, in the back of our minds is, well, if I ask this curious question, it's going to open a conversation and I don't have time. I have 2 minutes. So let me get this done in the most efficient way I can. And I think that mitigates as well. It's quicker. It's easier just to get down to the dirty and get the question done. So I think those are competing forces, which I think mean that we tell more than we ask.
Mm-hmm. And I think what you said, it's the default. That's a really good way of sort of bottom lining it. It's not that the people that I coach don't ask questions. Of course they do,
Yeah.
It's just that the default is to tell, to talk, to direct, and as you said, what I really resonated with is the point about being stretched thin and short on time. Because, let's be honest here, to ask a really curious question, you kind of have to slow down.
Yeah.
You have to become present.
Yeah.
And if you're on autopilot, kind of going through your day, getting stuff done and ticking things off your box,
Yeah.
that doesn't leave a lot of space.
No, there's a different energy to it, Yeah.
There really is. And I think the other barrier to this is that most managers or leaders kind of define their role as having answers. You're not the one with the questions. People come to you with questions and you have the answers, right?
Yeah.
And so if you define yourself as a leader, as being sort of the answer man or the answer woman, this requires a mindset shift to really get into asking curious questions.
Yeah.
So clearly there's some good reasons why talking and telling is our default, as people and as leaders and managers. And so we have to actually make this a very intentional practice, right, Irvine? It doesn't happen
absolutely
without that. Okay. So, but before we even talk about what are some good questions or when might we do this, I think we have to talk about the benefits of doing so, because why would somebody want to do the work of slowing down when they don't feel like it and pausing to be curious and ask a question when to them it would be much easier just to stay in the default mode, that they're in, right? Yeah. So what do you think, Irvine? I mean, at the end of the day, why bother doing it?
Well, I think there's a number of things that come to mind for me. One is, when you think about the quality of a conversation where I'm just telling someone either a snippet of information, et cetera, as entering into something that's a little more expansive and really putting the ball on their court. Yeah. And so they're owning it now. So I think, first of all, ownership is an important thing. I think whenever you enter into a curious conversation with someone and you're asking good questions, you're causing them to think a little deeper, to think about what it is that the topic is. It's a problem or something. You're actually inviting them for their own insights. And so therefore, what might be generated from that conversation, I think people are more likely to take ownership of it. And then I think a close cousin to that one then is independence. So therefore, if we can kind of, we've said the default is the telling, but if we can build up this muscle of curiosity and helping people be more thoughtful about situations and perhaps solutions to problems as they arise and challenges they're having, to kind of build up their own sense of autonomy and independence, then I think people become less dependent on us for the solution. And I think it frees them up to kind of develop and be more creative and more critical. And I think, creativity is something we've talked about before, but creativity is sorely missing. And I think this is a pathway to that. And then I think the final thing, which is incredibly important, is and you can just feel this, it's creating connection. Yeah. Whenever we've talked about the presence is different. We've talked about the energy is different. And what's happening there is there's an appreciation, an unspoken appreciation, I think, of someone who is taking time to ask a question and to listen to us. And that creates a sense of belonging, of value, of being respected, of someone who wants to hear from us. And of course, studies are replete. If you look at recent article in the Harvard Business Review pointing to the fact that questions create interpersonal bonding, this kind of bonding. And people love to be asked questions. Yeah. It creates liking. And who doesn't want someone to take time and to enter into dialogue with us? And it's really adding to that interpersonal relationship. And so the ironic thing is, the more we listen and the less we talk, the greater the bond of connection. And therein is an incredible factoid about human. And we crave it. We crave that connection. We still do. Mm-hmm. So I'm just curious, Bridget, about your own experience. You've been coaching many, many years now. I'm curious if you have an example of a client who kind of inspired you, an example of someone who was just really in this space of asking curious questions, and what difference did it make for them?
I do. While you were talking, I was actually thinking of this client. I want to share her story in a minute because it really stands out to me. But I want to go back to something you said about connection and bonding. Mm-hmm. Ed Friedman, who we've mentioned many times on this podcast, right? Yeah. Said that you can't influence a relationship system that you're not connected to. They won't hear you.
Yeah.
You can talk as loud or as eloquently as you want.
Yeah.
But if you're not connected to them, their backs are to you and they're walking away essentially. And so what I think is kind of interesting to consider is that if we want to be more influential, right? If we want to influence the people around us more, it's not going to really come through talking more eloquently. It's going to come through this connection where we ask curious questions and we listen deeply. And then we add to that in a shared dialogue. So it's just such a great thing to remember. Because I think in our minds, we're like, oh, if I want to have greater influence, I have to find a way to speak more. Maybe not,
Yeah.
So back to the example while you were talking. So here's what I thought of. I was coaching a pretty young manager and she had great instincts, but she was pretty young. And she had 2 direct reports and she wasn't satisfied with the one-on-one she was having with them, right? So I suggested that maybe she think about being a little more curious in these one-on-ones and asking some questions because that's not the nature. That wasn't how she ran them, right? And she goes, that's true. I want to try that. And so she decided she would. And we brainstormed some questions, but she also just came up with some of her own. And a couple of the questions she, shared with me that she asked, and one of them that she loved is she said, I asked both of them, what do you love most about your job? And she said, we had the most wonderful conversation. And I don't know why I never thought to ask him that. It had never occurred to her to ask that question. And she said, I learned so much about them just from that one question, But then she did other things that I thought were really great. So they had a metrics-driven job. And so you could share data and just look and see, what was going on in terms of your results and what were some of the things happening that the data revealed. And she's like, in the past, what I would do is share the data and then tell them, see, this is what you need to do more of to be more successful. You need to do this, this, and this, because that's what the data shows. And they would nod their heads, yes, because that's what the data showed. She said, instead, I shared the data and then I just said, what do you see in this? And like, what are some things you think you could do to be more successful in the way you want to be successful? And that question seemed to really change the dynamic. And she goes, you know what? A lot of times they had really good insights and I didn't have to say much. And sometimes I did add, but it just had, like, to your point, Irvine, the conversation started to have a different energy. And then were other questions that she found really useful. But here's how I want to bottom line it. In pretty short amount of time, I would say over a period of a month, she said she noticed significant changes, not only in their level of connection, but in their performance and their ownership on the job.
Yeah.
And a kind of a simple tweak, but I think something that yielded some pretty powerful, results, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one story. How about you, Irvine? You have a story to share?
I have been doing a set of workshops with a company that I work with, and it's around emotional intelligence. And there's a question I always ask at the beginning, which is, I want you to think about a mentor or a leader that's really impacted you and some of the qualities. I always have a little opportunity then for people to kind of give me a little flavor, a little taste of that person. Last week, a person wrote down one of the qualities was they asked different questions is the way they express it. And I said, I'm curious, tell me a little more about that. And they said, oh, this is a person who was a manager a few years ago and just their style was so different and amazing. And I said, well, what you mentioned there about questions? He said, yeah, he said, we would be discussing some of the problems and they would just kind of take their time and they would just say, I don't know what questions to ask here. Has anyone here got some really good questions that might open the space for us to explore this problem?
Wow.
And they said it was so great. It's like, people themselves were kind of like, well, what was the question? No, I don't. Oh, that's a good question. Oh, that's a good question. So it was almost like this invitation collectively to be in curiosity, which I thought, wow, that's so beautiful. And it obviously had a huge impact on this person because they still remembered it. And they said, as a manager, I actually do this every now and again. So it was almost creating a collective curiosity, which I thought was beautiful.
Oh, that is really interesting. I've actually never heard of that before.
Yeah.
So the question that they asked was, so he's sitting around with the team.
Yeah.
The team is facing a challenge or an opportunity or problem, and they said,
And
well,
he basically admits, he said, I don't know what question to ask. Does anyone here have a great question that would help us explore this?
see, I love that because it wasn't even like, I don't know, but let me ask this question. It was, what are the questions that might help us explore this really well?
Yeah.
Oh my God, that is really terrific. I love that example.
Yeah.
Well, maybe our listeners will like that too and tuck that one away. I think that, what helps us to start practicing this is one, intentionality, but two, to have in our back pocket some questions that we want to start with, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So let's build on this, Irvine, and, get a little more specific about like when and where would asking curious questions be a really good idea for a manager or a leader? What are your thoughts?
Well, there's a few situations I think which are tried and true, and they come up many, many times. And if you haven't had this as a manager leader, you sure will. So I think the first one is obvious is delegating. Delegating done badly tends to be a one-way conversation done very quickly and with very little check-in if true understanding has been met. And all too often people are quick to say, yes, I understand when they don't, because they feel that that's the correct answer. And delegating is a beautiful opportunity to add a little snippet of curiosity. And so things like, what questions or concerns do you have about this assignment? When do you think is a reasonable time? So like, so how often we say to someone, I want this done in the day, do they think that's reasonable or not? Like what do they think is reasonable? And it's also opening the opportunity for people to say, well, here's what you don't know about what else I am doing, which is great. And then following on for that, what might you need to reprioritize to get this done if I have a very tight deadline? What haven't I covered that could help you? Like what help do you need to execute this well? And are there any obstacles that I don't know about that could get in the way? So these are just beautiful questions that are inviting a person. You're giving a person permission to kind of continue the dialogue so that this task that's being delegated can really be completed well. So I think that's one. And then the other one is just in regular check-ins, hopefully we're moving away from the annual talk with your boss and more into much more regular kind of little check-in conversations that, and I think these are really beautiful opportunities to ask questions, what's on your mind these days? We know that workers that tend to have high satisfaction are workers that feel challenged and that are growing and developing. So maybe a check-in question there. Are you growing and being challenged right now in ways that are meaningful for you?
I love that one because, Irvine, to your point, a lot of times we wait until a performance review conversation to ask a question like that, right?
Yes.
But by then, it's like we've lost an opportunity. What if they don't feel challenged 6 months earlier?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah.
What else?
What's working well? Where are you getting stuck? Are two great questions. How can I best support you in achieving your goals? And, sometimes people will say, well, I can't think of anything. If you get that answer back and say, okay, maybe that question came out of the blue, but you know what? Why don't you just think about that? And maybe let's have a conversation about that the next time. How might I best support your goals? That's great as well. So that's another one, this is the regular one. And then I want to go back to an episode we had recently about breaking out of the leadership bubble. What that episode was about is that sometimes leaders are very insulated. They're in their bubble and cut off from a little bit of honest feedback and truth telling, which is really what's called for. And, no one really wants to tell a leader what needs to be heard. A curious question, if a leader wants the beginnings of the bursting of the bubble, could be, what is something you wish I was more aware of, but no one has the courage to share with me? It's almost a little dare. I dare you, share that, but you're giving me permission for people to share that. I think that's a really great question. How about you, Bridget? Anything else that comes to mind?
Well, you know what? Those are great questions. And I'm sure our listeners are like jotting them down furiously,
Mhm.
trying to, remember them. I think there's one more. And this is, I think if you don't know where to start with asking curious questions, this is a great place to start, which is this. If an employee comes to you, and they often do, with a challenge and they want your advice, right? So maybe they come to you and you say, oh, they say something like, oh, Irvin, I just really value your wisdom and your knowledge, and I'm bumping up against this challenge, and I just really want to know what you think I should do. Right. Now there's a seduction there, right?
Mm.
Because they're like, oh, I want to know what you think because you're so knowledgeable. And I think it's easy to just tell them what you think and say, oh, this is what I would do,
Yeah, yeah.
And sometimes that's perfectly fine. But another tweak, another option is to say, hey, you know what, Irvin, that is an interesting challenge. And I do have some ideas which I can share. But you know what? I'm really curious what you think. And I'm wondering what are some initial thoughts or ideas you might have. And the beauty, I think, of this is twofold. I mean, one is it signals that you actually value their thinking, their
Mm.
capacity, that you have confidence. And then it also trains them over time to realize that, when they come to you, it's going to be a dialogue. It's not going to be a monologue in which they ask you what you think and then you download everything you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Really small tweak. I don't know. What do you think about that, Irvin?
I love that. I really do. I think it really helps people, instead of kind of the back and the forth of kind of I'm on this side and you're on that side. It's almost like you're asking a person, you're putting the problem on the table, you're asking the person to sit beside you, and then it's like, let's look at this together.
Yes.
And so I think that energy is really beautiful. So it is.
Yeah. I like what you said there. You're sort of putting it in the middle and saying, let's take a look together. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really awesome. Okay, so I'm guessing some of our listeners might be saying, well, this is all well and fine, but I mean, sometimes I just got to tell them what to do or tell them what I think, right? Of course. Like it's even like, do you remember, Irvin, when we were first in coaching, getting trained as coaches? And it was like, don't ever tell people, just ask questions,
Yes.
and you're just like sitting on your hand. You're like, we are not saying that. Sometimes it is perfectly appropriate, in fact, the right thing to do to just speak clearly and plainly and directly about what you think or what you expect. So,
Yeah.
like, when is that? Well, one place for sure is when you've already made up your mind about something. You've already made up a decision in your head.
Yeah.
And what you do is you're a little bit tentative about just saying that. And so you start asking your team questions, but you're really just wanting them to get to the decision you've made. Don't do that because all that does is kind of erode trust, because pretty soon people pick up on it that you're not really asking them what they think. You're trying to guide them to the
Yeah.
decision you've already made, right? You've
Yeah.
seen that before, right, Irvin?
Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I think another place is like, it's so important to clearly tell people what your expectations are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do not play around with that. Do not ask questions about that. Tell them so that they can hit the mark. That's another place where, of course, you should tell, you should share. And I think one other one is when anxiety and emotions are running really high, whether there's a very urgent matter, there's a crisis, there's a window that's open, but it's only going to be open for a few seconds and you got to walk through it. Then we expect leaders to take command, right?
Yeah.
We expect them to speak authoritatively and directly and say, here's what we're going to do. And this is why we're going to do it.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make sure our listeners didn't think that we were saying, don't ever tell, just only ask, because that is certainly not the case, right? So, Irvin, I can see you nodding your head. Our listeners can't. So I think a lot of that you agree with, but
I do.
share your thoughts. And is there anything else you want to add?
I think a common fault you get into as well, and I've seen this a lot, is that asking curious questions is actually a skill, and it takes a little bit of practice. And sometimes especially when we're coming, the most greatest temptation is that when someone's coming to us, say an employee is coming to us with a problem, and we know what the answer is. And then we go into, I'm going to be curious. But what you can find then is them asking some leading questions. And what we mean by a leading question is it's really not curious. It's masked in curiosity, but really it's leading the person to a place that we want them to be rather than an exploration. So say, for example, say an underperforming employee, someone comes like, well, how do I deal with that person? And maybe a curious question was, well, that's really interesting. Like, what are some of the things that you've thought about? And then kind of a leading question would be, that's really interesting. I've often thought in the past that bringing in HR early is very good. What do you think about that? You're leading them down a path that you really want them to go. And so it's really not open and curious. And some of the benefits then about the independence and all the things we talked about are being lost. But that's a real common mistake.
Oh, for sure. And, what's happening is that we're wanting to exercise a muscle, but we're exercising it at the wrong time or in the wrong way, right? Because if you just really have an idea that you want to share with somebody and you feel like it's a great idea, just share it,
Yep.
And then maybe kind of get into a dialogue. But yeah, I had a client come to a coaching session not too long ago, and she was sharing with me that she got into this long conversation and she was really trying to ask curious questions, but they never got to where she wanted them to go. And I was like, wait, back up.
I know. Let me back up.
Yeah. So anyways, I think the last thought I would say, Irvine, is this distinction between inquiry and interrogation. And we know when we're being interrogated, and we know when someone's being very curious with us, they feel really different, right? So yeah.
Wow, this has been such a great conversation. And hopefully it has sparked some curiosity in our listeners and a little reflection about what type of questions am I asking? And where in my role might I add a little ounce of curiosity? And maybe that's a way to kind of approach what we've been talking about today. Maybe a homework or an invitation for you is, think about your week ahead. Think about some of the meetings that you have, some of the tasks that you have, and maybe choose one where you think, what's a curious question that I could ask in that meeting? How can I add a little dose of curiosity? And I think, when we're thinking about how do we develop this skill, I think that's a great place to start. Being specific, choosing a situation and then really thinking about that and thinking about, here's a question I might want to ask, but what's a curious take on that question? And then just kind of after the meeting, just have, well, how did that work? What did I notice? Did I notice anything different? So maybe that's the challenge I would invite you to embrace in this coming week.
I love that, Irvine. I had this thought pop into my head while you said that. What about looking on the home front, and what personal relationships might you think about? What's a curious question I could ask my spouse or my partner or my child or my mother or whatever? Because those are the people that we often stop asking curious questions with. So another invitation as well. Well, Irvine, thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, this is great.
All right. Take care, listeners.
Okay. Take care. On to the next episode. Bye now.
Bye-bye.